Welcome to our podcast. This is the second of a four-part series. In the last episode, we learned that human wrongs are being masqueraded as human rights. Ironically, this is being done by the European Union and the United Nations, which was originally formed to protect universal human rights, including the rights of parents, children, and religion. In this episode, we will learn why the United Nations is doing this. Professor Alan Carlson is perhaps the world's authority on the history of the natural family, and he is also a founder of the World Congress of Families. Alan, can you share some history of the United Nations and the natural family?
The United Nations has a kind of a checkered record on issues of family life and population. The initial United Nations document dealing with family life was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a solid document, approved 1948, contains solid pro-family and pro-life language. It was, again, a solid document. Article 16C, the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society entitled to protection by society and the state.
Today, we also have Susan Roylance, an author and international policy language expert. Since 1995, she has been involved in dozens of United Nations conferences and policy negotiations. Susan, can you share with us some of the insights to the history of the United Nations?
In the beginning, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created by the United Nations. It was a couple years later after the Charter. It's the oldest, and it is the most accepted document in the world. It's very, very, very good. And it has wonderful language about the family. It has wonderful language about marriage. It has wonderful language about parents being responsible for the education of their children. It's just an amazing document. And it's one of the reasons why we have other good documents that coalesce underneath that basic document that was created so wonderfully.
In the early 1950s, certain figures were appointed to prominent positions at the UN who brought in a different focus. Instead of the focus on the natural family, they've been to bring in a focus determined by and large by socialist and feminist constructs.
Sharon Slater is the president of Family Watch International. Sharon, can you tell us and give us insight in working with the United Nations?
In the United States, when the women lost the equality bill that, many years ago, there was a big fight. Many of those radical feminists, when they lost that fight here for the Equal Rights Amendment, they took their fight to the United Nations. And they realized that that system was very easily penetrated, and they could start to get themselves involved in the different UN agencies. They could get themselves positioned on UN treaty bodies. They're monitoring the compliance with the treaties, or they could get the right people, their friends, as experts that were going to expound on all these human rights. And they could use the entire human rights system to advance what we call human wrongs. They have a very anti-motherhood agenda at the United Nations, and there's always debates when any positive language about motherhood is put forward, because if mothers are taking care of their children, then they're not in the workforce competing, and they want women to be competing and going through the glass ceiling. So motherhood is being stigmatized. In fact, you have the CEDAW committee. This is the committee that monitors compliance with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And they actually recommended Belarus for instituting a Mother's Day.
There have been various strains of feminism. One strain called maternalism is actually, I think, quite good. But the other strain, equity feminism, wanted to abolish all forms of male-female difference. Wanted to abolish the good version, the ideal version of sexual complementarity. Men and women are equal before God, and on all fundamental levels equal before the law, but they did different things in society, particularly relative to procreation and children. And they wanted to get rid of that and go to an absolute sense of equality that would trample the complementarity of men and women, enshrined in Scripture, enshrined, again, in the evolutionary narrative, is fundamental to the human race. The international congresses, they were convened in Beijing, in Cairo, Copenhagen, Istanbul, that touched on family life directly or indirectly, had a clear purpose, which was to basically displace the concept of the natural family, which had been in the initial Universal Declaration, with a radically different set of understandings.
Yeah, those 7 conferences in the 90s were very dangerous. And they began that process of changing a lot of things. So that, and now we're reaping a lot. I mean, we're 23 years later now.
By gathering in Beijing, we are focusing world attention on issues that matter most in our lives, the lives of women and their families.
We had this petition we did for Hillary Clinton, because Hillary was the head of the delegation that was going to Beijing conference, asking for them to recognize mothers in the document, that motherhood was important. At the forum in Beijing, we had a booth and we had this big petition that people could sign and that wanted to have motherhood recognized in the document. I wrote an article for the newspaper when we were in Beijing and says, what good is advancement if the women are unhappy? because most of the radical feminists at that time were very caustic. They're actually not as bad now because they've recognized it's necessary for public relations to be a little bit more accommodating. They were very caustic and it was very difficult. And one day I looked at all of them in a room and I said, you know, I really don't think they know what a really happy family is. And if you don't know that, then it's harder to promote happy families or good families or families that can do things.
It took a while for those ideas to work their way through the system, but by the 1990s, the United Nations bureaucracy, when it returned fairly aggressively to population and family questions, came at those issues, again, from a socialist and feminist perspective.
Alan, you mentioned how socialism has influenced how family is viewed at the United Nations. Can you tell us more about that history?
Well, certainly one philosophy that lay behind it was goes back to early Marxism as one of the variant, but the most virulent of socialism. Always saw the state as a necessary replacement for the family. The family in Marxist ideology was understood to be a bourgeois construct built on the repression of women, and Marx and Engels, the architects of communism, argued that it had to be replaced. The independent home had to be replaced by the collectivized home. Children would be raised socially rather than by their parents. Meals would be taken collectively. Collective child care. Women had to be out of the home into the workplace. Those were all basic tenets of communist theory.
Don Feder is also with us today. Don has written hundreds of publications and articles about the history of the family and the demographic winter crisis that has taken place worldwide. Don, how has communist ideologies influenced the family and religion in the world today?
There was Antonio Gramsci and cultural Marxism. Gramsci was a Marxist. He was imprisoned by Mussolini. He was an Italian Marxist. From 1919 until the end of World War II, Russia, Soviet Russia, was the only communist country. So Gramsci wanted to know why, and it was a question that was driving him crazy. Finally, he came up with an interesting hypothesis. He said the reason the world isn't going communist, the reason the proletariat in every country isn't rising and casting off their chains is because the church and the family have given them what Gramsci called a false class consciousness. Therefore, Gramsci said, in order for Marxism to triumph, we'd have to get rid of the family and the church. Gramsci's ideas were adopted by the Frankfurt School, notably Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse came to the United States, and in the 1950s he became the mentor, the intellectual father of a new left.
Thank you, Don. As we all know, the new left gave rise to a sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s, and also to the decline of religious observances. Susan, UN founding documents established a universal right to religion. Why are UN attitudes so different now?
I mean, all of the original things are very strong, religion. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is strong. It's been over the years. And actually, as I said, those 7 conferences in the 90s were very dangerous. Why are religious freedoms opposed? I will tell you sadly, the biggest reason they are is because feminists, radical feminists, believe that the patriarchal religion, where men are given special consideration, is wrong and should be eliminated. And if you have to eliminate a religion to do that, that's what you have to do. And so religious values respect life. It's religious people that are pro-life. People who don't care about eliminating babies while they're forming in the mother's womb are generally not religious. They don't have that feeling that every life is important. Honesty, basic honesty. You'd think everybody would want that, but as long as you get what you should in their mind, what should is, you don't want religions teaching things that are different than what they're trying to establish in law. And so people who don't believe in God, there's a lot of these things that are very movable, what's right and what's wrong. And there's no right and wrong. So when we go to some of these conferences, and there's some things that are very definitely right and some things that are very definitely wrong in our mind. And that's what we work for. If they could get rid of our religious upbringing, it would make it easier for them to do some of these things. But really, it's men. The radical feminists don't want men. They don't want men to do anything. They don't want men. I don't know why they can't understand the importance of a father to children.
I've said that it's the women that lost the Equal Rights Amendment in the United Nations that went there to radical feminism. But there's also those who are population control people for environmental purposes. Like they believe there's too many people, they want to reduce the population.
The population control movement really started more with environmentalists who thought that we were overrunning the earth, we were causing problems. In fact, Bella Abzug, who was the head of the We Do organization, World Environmental and Development Organization, they really believed that they wanted to return the earth to its pristine glory. They were literally tree huggers. They believed in the beauty of the earth and that it ought to be preserved and not allowed to be damaged by humans.
There's been an attempt, a very strong attempt, to suppress fertility in all nations of the globe. The attempt has been to, by the UN and the major figures at the UN, the enemies of the family, have been pursuing an agenda to diminish the number of children. Children have been seen as a problem rather than a resource.
When I first started going to the UN, population control was a big issue, and everybody was constantly talking about population control in one way or another. ICPD in Cairo, that was a population conference. Actually, one of the interesting conferences that dealt with population was the World Summit on Food, the World Food Summit. And Bob went to one of these a big news conference thing where everybody of major news importance was there. And they went through all these things all day, went through all of these things, and then they said, well, what's the solution? And they said, pick up this paper when you leave. And the paper says, contact your local Planned Parenthood or population control place and support them, because the only answer is to reduce population.
Ralph Truom Sr., a pastor from Washington, D.C., is with us. Now, Ralph, what insights can you give us?
I was at a seminar just the other day, and Teresa Okafor from Nigeria spoke. And she said very clearly and very succinctly that if the efforts of the faith community in the United States don't succeed in derailing Planned Parenthood, Planned Parenthood's policies are going to decimate Africa, because Planned Parenthood, with the aid and the assistance of the United Nations, is extorting third world countries to change their sovereign laws, their constitutions, which have written into them anti-sodomy and anti-abortion language. They're telling them that they have to change that language in order to continue to receive the valuable international aid that they need in order for their countries to survive.
We discovered in Africa that there was plenty of contraceptives freely available to people all over. And you go along the main highways, there's a lot of pharmacies. They're not for antibiotics and things that will help people stay healthy. They're to prevent the having of children. And they're widely distributed, and there's a lot of money. And some of it comes from countries who produce a lot of these contraceptives, and so they have big programs to promote the use of contraceptives so that they can sell them and they make money, and the UN will pay for it and the governments will pay for it.
But what's happened is the donor countries that are funding the UN agencies are really actually bullying and blackmailing some of the developing countries with all this money. Money has taken over the whole system. It's taken over the UN human rights system, so that now you have really harmful things being promoted as human rights, even though they're not. We had the opportunity to go to Pakistan after it was the 5-year review of the Fourth World Conference on Women. And we worked very closely with the delegates from Pakistan. They were great leaders, and we worked very closely with them, and so they invited me. But the interesting thing is, after we arrived there, we learned that the government of Pakistan had been told that if they didn't reduce their population to 2 children or less, they wouldn't be able to get any financial help from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank. And they were working on that, trying to do that. I also had the opportunity of going to Sudan, and that was an interesting experience. And interestingly, the woman who I worked with, she had only had 2 children, and here I had 7. Catherine Baumhorst, I think she had 6. I'm not sure how many she had, and then another person had, and she said, "They really sold us a bill of goods." She says, "We thought we weren't supposed to have any more children than that."
We also have with us Bill Saunders, a Harvard Law School graduate. He is also a professor of human rights at the Catholic University of America. Bill, what would you like the listeners to understand?
The UN, in my opinion, is still way too much under the sway of these kind of folks that are population controllers. And they're trying to control it through international documents. They still continue to do that. What the aim of these people is to have a lot of documents that vaguely talk in terms that they can then get activist courts to say mean abortion. And there's a lot of pressure on countries to limit their population. The sad thing, and there's many sad things, but one of the sad things there is we've lost our sense of history. What were the population controllers all about to begin with? It's to control the brown and black people.
And the motto of eugenics was more births for the fit, fewer births for the unfit. Well, who was fit, who was unfit? It wasn't based on IQ, it was based on race. You know, Northern Europeans were fit. They should be having more children because they were more intelligent.
You know, it's selfish, racist stuff, you know. We want less of them. Part of it is our privileged lives will maybe not be as privileged, and also we don't like them because they're different. That's horrible, vicious stuff, and it was part of the progressive movement, and it was expressly part of the population control movement, And it's amazing that it hasn't been disavowed. But in fact, a lot of people, the UN, however, whether they all know it or intend it or not, are the intellectual heirs of that stuff.
It's so interesting for me because in the beginning, all of the conferences were pushing population control. Now, they don't dare mention population control, but it's because it's a big problem. It's not a solution, it's a problem.
I mean, if you look at it from a statistical point of view, demographic winter is almost irrefutable. The fertility rate, the number of children the average woman on this planet had in 1960 was 5. Today, I think worldwide it's 2.6 and falling. Replacement level fertility is 2.1, roughly. All of the industrialized countries have below replacement fertility. For the European Union as a whole, it's 1.5. These countries with fertility rates of 1.3 or lower, all other things being equal, will lose roughly half of their population every 45 years. Countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, fertility rate is much lower. Not surprisingly, by the way, economic decline is also related to this.
It's impossible any longer to argue that a country gains economically by shrinking its size. It just doesn't work. That's not how economies work. Economies work and grow on the dynamic new minds and hands and hearts that come along.
Like I said, China's population was going to peak around 2030 and never double again. So they didn't even need to have the one-child policy. Demographers could project that, but instead they did this one-child policy. They killed millions of people. And they've screwed up their whole economic future. So,
developing countries know that demographic winter is caused by anti-family values like those in the West. And they don't want them in their own countries. We have with us the Honorable Lucy Akello. Also, Ambassador Dahab, what would you like to share with us today?
I just gave the example of how we look at life. Sacred, precious, beautiful. It doesn't matter whether I have money or not. No, it doesn't matter. Life is life. It doesn't matter. And let me tell you, in those days, people would give birth to 10, 12 children. And they had a mechanism of bringing up these children. They had a mechanism of teaching them.
The proponents of the sexual revolution in the 60s came up after 4 or 5 decades to regret it. So that is a vindication of let us keep these options, especially if other regions like Asia and Africa are in favor of family. Don't coerce them. Don't try to politicize this issue. Don't try to standardize your values on others or your convictions, better to say convictions rather than values on others, because this will serve humanity in some future time. You don't know.
I want this narrative to change and say, we want to control the population. People must be on contraceptives. But I mean, these are harmful things to us.
Stefano Gironani is the Vice President of Legal Studies at CFAM. Stefano, what insights can you share with us?
I'm very Augustinian in that sense. I believe most people do what they do because they think they're doing what's right. And they believe that the current Western culture, which I would call very decadent, especially when it comes to sexual mores, is somehow something that should be exported, that's something good, that ultimately sexual autonomy is the highest good a person can aspire to. And so a lot of people are acting on that basis, but I do think also there's a lot of people who are thinking strategically, who are thinking demographically, Western countries are going away. They're going to lose influence and power over the next 2 generations for sure. Where we will be 2-3 generations from now, it's not clear because we know never in history have we experienced the demographic decline that we've experienced now. So nobody can make predictions. And I think there are people who essentially, they know that Europe and European countries, Western countries, are going to lose influence culturally around the globe. And so this is like a last-ditch attempt to enshrine a cultural dominance of sort, making the rest of the world more Western-friendly, preparing for ultimately the West's decline.
Sharon and Alan, any final thoughts about the agenda that is being advanced on the world today?
I've said that it's the women that lost the Equal Rights Amendment in the United Nations that went there to radical feminism. But there's also those who are population control people for environmental purposes. Like they believe there's too many people, they want to reduce the population, and all these sexual issues actually work really well for their agenda. Transgenderism, if you go through those surgeries, you become infertile for life. Comprehensive sexuality education is contraception, condoms. That's one of the major pushes. And if not, if you get pregnant and then abortion, people who are sexually active are much less likely to form a stable family and then have a family where they actually keep the children and don't abort them. So all these agendas work for population control. Once you destroy the family in a country, it's proven if you first destroy marriage, if you sexualize children, that it leads to the weakening of nations and can lead to the downfall of the entire country.
One main message is the need to raise up again the very concept of what the natural family is. What does that mean? In all the fuss and turmoil that's been going on in recent decades, raised up by the sexual revolution, by the new wave of feminism that came, of equity feminism that came in the 60s and 70s, by the population control movement, to recover the very concept of the natural family as laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and why that's vitally important to the health of nations, to the health of the globe. That's the first agenda. Another agenda is to resurrect an understanding regarding the value of population growth as opposed to the so-called value of population decline. Population decline doesn't mean there's more to share among those who are left behind. It almost always means a shriveling of resources, a shriveling of economic life. It's a ticket for social and economic and political decline. So that's another major thing. We've also have to understand the concept, oddly enough, of marriage. It's not the first time the human race has, again, forgotten the critical, vital importance of a strong marriage culture. And it happens maybe literally thousands of times in the human past. It's our era, in our time, we have to resurrect the concept of authentic natural marriage. And why it's not just a lifestyle choice, but indeed is the life choice for any nation, any people that want to survive and go forward.
In this episode, we have seen why some of these destructive human wrongs are happening. We've also seen that human wrongs are being masqueraded as human rights. We hope that you have learned from this podcast. We hope that you will take courage to stand for the family worldwide. The next episode is number 3. In it, we will learn more about how the rights of children, parents, and religion are being undermined. Please join us